Now on Book TV, Ilan Berman predicts the collapse of Russia due to internal social and demographic decline and external challenges from China. It's about an hour.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys, and I love that John is making his way off the stage, so that when you throw things at me, you have an unimpeded view. Thank you, as always, for your interest, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me. It's always nice to come out and talk about issues that I work a lot on in the privacy of my office, and I get to sort of share it with a broader audience. Let me start sort of where John ended, which is to talk about the external first, and then sort of to focus on the internal. The question of Russia and sort of where Russia is heading, not only ideologically, but also geopolitically and demographically, has been something that I've spent a lot of time looking at, both professionally and personally. My personal history is that I'm the child of Soviet refuseniks, and so I sort of have the culture in my blood. I have the language sort of in my head most of the time, and so and I've spent quite a bit of time in Russia. So it really sort of allows you to get a different bit of a sense. And what I'm struck by is that historically, and by historically I don't mean sort of decades, but certainly in recent years, we Americans, whether we're Republican or Democrat, we tend to look at Russia as one that is striding very large on the world stage. And by the way, you just have to crack a newspaper in the last couple of weeks, and you'll understand exactly why we do that. We've seen Russian President Vladimir Putin really cut quite a striking geopolitical image, strong-arming us into this deal, Syrian deal. But I think strong-arming actually is probably a wrong word, because strong-arming suggests we weren't willing. We were more than willing to accept a deal that walked us off the ledge of military action against Syria. By the way, it's a deal that is very useful for the Obama administration. I would argue it's much more useful for the Russian Federation, because it enshrines the stability of the Syrian regime, right? If it was an open question that the Assad regime might no longer be in power before, it's certainly not an open question now, because we need him in power in order to provide us with access to the chemical weapons that we're supposed to dismantle. And not only that, but for the Russians, all sorts of ancillary benefits accrue, because Syria has been, since 1971, the way station and the home port for Russia's Mediterranean flotilla. So preserving the Assad regime's hold on power, preserving its stability, is a huge coup for the Russian Federation. It's the tangible benefits for us, I think, still remain to be seen. From Damascus, from the discussion about Damascus, you saw President Putin jet off to Tehran, in which he talked about Russia's cooperation with Iran's nuclear program and the potential reactivation of a sale of controversial S-300 missiles to the Iranian regime, something that was tabled during the Medvedev era in Moscow. So again, not great progress. But all of this is symptomatic, I think, of something that we're all sensing when we look at U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is not very strategic, at least of late. It's not very assertive. And as a result, there has been an effort by Russia, an opportunistic effort to sweep in and take this strategic advantage. And the Russian government has done, I think, a very successful job. And as a result, it projects an image of a country that's on the march. But if you look at what's happening within Russia itself, it's, I think, very clear that that perception is wrong. Russia may appear strong now internationally, but internally it's approaching a transformation. I would argue it's a transformation that's going to be, when it sets in, every bit as earth-shattering as the collapse of the Soviet Union was some 2 decades ago. And this upheaval is really the product of 3 trends that are beginning to emerge now, but are on trajectory to intersect in a very dramatic way. So the first is, very simply, that Russia is dying, demographically speaking. For those of you that aren't demographers, first of all, good for you, because it's not the most exciting of professions. But for those of you that are demographers, you know that 2.1 is the magic number. During the lifespan of a woman, during the fertility lifespan of a woman, she should, ostensibly, create 1 child to replace herself, 1 child to replace her husband, and some fraction thereof to account for natural disasters, for earthquakes, hurricanes, what have you. And a population that sits at what's called replenishment rate, 2.1, is a population that remains stable over time. The United States is pretty much there. We can talk about sort of the drivers of what drives U.S. Population. But what's clear is that a whole bunch of countries, certainly in Europe, are well below replenishment rate. And Russia ranks near the bottom. Russia, according to UN statistics, is at 1.6, which means that Russia is, every generation is constricting. What this looks like in practice, if you read Russian statistics and read the Russian census, is that Russia, as a result of both natural death and of emigration from the Russian Federation, is constricting by close to 500,000 people every year. So Vladimir Putin, in December of 2012, when he was giving one of his umpteen presidential campaign speeches, talked about the fact that according to the trend lines that his government was seeing, if this trend line is not ameliorated, by 2050, the entire population of the Russian Federation, which is 142.9 million now, will shrink down by about a quarter to 107 million people. Right? That is a massive constriction of the human capital that Russia has currently and can access as it moves into the future. The reasons for this, I think, are manifold, but it's worth at least sort of drawing them out. The first is that Russia, unlike the United States, never experienced a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War in terms of investiture in social and cultural and educational infrastructure. What this looks like in practice is that life expectancy, median life expectancy for Russian males today is the same as it is in Madagascar. It's age 60. The life expectancy for Russian females is a little bit better. It's 73, the same as it is in Saudi Arabia. But both numbers are a decade to a decade and a half lower than they are for their analog governments in Europe and in the United States. Right? So, and part of the reason for this is that as a function of Russian GDP, healthcare expenditures in Russia have remained constant since the mid-1990s. The Russian government simply isn't spending more money on the welfare of its people, and it shows. It shows in the numbers. The second reason why Russia's demographics are tanking is that you're seeing a wholesale collapse of the Russian family. During the Cold War, Soviet families, by and large, stuck together, not necessarily because they all liked each other, because we all know that we have members in our family that we could just as soon export to other cities, but because they had no choice, because populations were locked in place and there was an extended family network that was cohesive and was kept together by political and economic circumstances. Today, it's exactly the opposite. According to the UN, Russia has the highest divorce rate in the world. Half of all Russian marriages, according to the UN, end in divorce, and 60% of them do so in the first decade. What this means is that long-term families, and as a result, the logical product of long-term families, which is multiple children, is increasingly an endangered species. So you could have a family that has one child, but you very rarely have families that have 4 or 5 or 6 children, which is what's necessary for demographic replenishment. You also have a rampant culture of abortion in Russia, which I think it's useful to stress on a number of levels. During the Cold War, and for those of you that are sort of students of the Cold War, you know that abortion was functionally the only available means of contraception. It was used widespread with terrible effects on female health and female fertility. This hasn't changed all that much. You've seen trend lines which suggest that there has been more awareness on the part of Russian authorities in terms of the negative effects and also even some investment. But in reality, the numbers are not all that much better. Today, in Russia, official statistics suggest that the rate of abortion is 1.2 million annually. That's equivalent to 300 an hour for a population of 142 million people. But, and this is where it gets even more grisly, if you listen to Russian doctors, private sector experts, they tell you that that network of publicly reported abortions is actually just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, the number could be twice that. It could be twice that because of private clinics, because of abortions that are done off the books, and because of abortions that are simply not reported. And that means that Russians are aborting the equivalent of 2% of their live population every year. And then, in a very real sense, killing off prospects for demographic growth in the process. Layered on top of that is something that Russian experts themselves call an epidemic in HIV/AIDS. This is bound up, I think this is a very complex phenomenon, so just to unpack it for you, AIDS came to the Russian Federation because of the way the Soviet Union was a closed society, functionally later in historic terms than it did to Europe and to the United States. But when it hit the Russian Federation, it hit with a vengeance. And today, something like 1% of the Russian Federation is estimated to be HIV positive. And this is being perpetuated and expanded by Russia's own culture of drug use. Russia has, according to UN statistics, and notice, by the way, I think it's important to stress that we're talking about UN statistics here, which are not the most forward-looking on demographics, but they certainly can be said to be the most impartial because they do these statistical aggregations for every country around the world. According to UN statistics, Russian consumption alone accounts for more than a fifth of heroin used worldwide. And since injectables are a primary means of the transfer of HIV, of the HIV virus, this is organically linked to the problems that Russia is experiencing with HIV/AIDS. Now, if Russia accounts for a fifth or more of all heroin consumed globally, notice the trend line. More than 1/3, according to the UN, of injectable drug users in Russia are HIV positive, right? And you spit it out from there, and you understand why Russian experts themselves talk about HIV and AIDS in the context of an epidemic, one that they have a very hard time getting their hands around and treating. The third trend, or fourth trend, that is compounding all of these ills is the fact that Russia's population is fleeing in a very real sense. The repressive practices of the current Russian state and dismal domestic conditions in economic and cultural and social terms are forcing Russians to eye the exits. And as a result, the pace of exodus from Russia, of emigration from Russia, right now rivals the outmigration that you saw a century ago when the Bolsheviks took power. More than 2 million Russians are estimated to have left since Putin took power in the last days of 1999. 1 in 5 Russians today desires to live abroad, and 40% of Russians between the ages of 18 and 35 are actively contemplating departure. Right? This is catastrophic because it gives you a window into the thinking of the Russian population writ large. These statistics are devastating, all the more so because they are symptoms of a population that has lost hope in its future and one that no longer trusts its government to be a steward of its needs. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't hopeful signs. There have been hopeful signs of late. If you have the misfortune of being a demographer, you know that over the last 8 months, Russia's actually had an uptick in fertility. Russia's demographics for the last 8 months, for 2013, has been positive, very modestly so, but enough that the Russian government has decided to declare victory and said, oh, our demographic crisis is over. We no longer have anything to worry about. Nonsense. Because if you talk to demographers who watch this over the long term, they'll tell you that these sort of blips, these peaks and valleys are normal over the long-term trend line. But the long-term trend line, all these things I talked about, collapse of the Russian family, the abortion rate, they all suggest that the spiral will still continue downward because there is no serious Russian official effort to counteract all the symptoms of the problem. Rather, what you see on the part of the Russian government is an effort to expand things that make Russians feel good about themselves, right? So you have a $600 to $800 billion effort put forth by the Russian government to expand infrastructure. Right? I put infrastructure in air quotes because infrastructure can mean anything you want it to mean. And so the Russian government has parlayed this investment in infrastructure into, for example, military modernization and the modernization of their strategic arsenal. They've put the term infrastructure to use when they talk about, for example, expansion of industries in certain remote towns. That's great. But this is not long-term investment in the types of things, healthcare system, education, social networks, medical recourse, that will allow Russians to rebound sustainably from this trend line. So this is the first trend, and I apologize for spending so much time on it, but it's useful to unpack what Russia's demographic decline means, why it's happening, and why it's important. The second trend line is to focus on one aspect of that, because Russia's demographic trend line isn't uniform. Russia is transforming. The country's Muslim population, when compared to the trend lines that I just laid out, is faring quite well. They don't abort as a matter of convenience. They don't drink, generally. They don't divorce, or divorce much less. They have a larger number of children per family unit. And as a result, what you see is, while the Russian population writ large is declining, the percentage of Muslims within the Russian population is actually expanding. So today, the back of the envelope estimates that Russian officials give you is that Muslims make up 16% of the overall population, about 21 million. But according to Russian government's own estimates, by the end of the decade, 1 in 5 Russians is going to be Muslim. And by the middle of the century, depending, again, not all projections say this, but some projections do, you're going to be rapidly approaching parity. Every other Russian is going to be Muslim, right? And that has a whole set of geopolitical implications that we'll talk about a little bit later. But nonetheless, the point to hammer home here is that Russia is transforming. And by the way, we're transforming. The United States is transforming. This is not a bad trend per se, except for the fact that the Russian Muslim minority has rapidly hit a glass ceiling. What you have is a population that is not well integrated, either economic or social terms, into the Russian state. Instead, you've seen the Russian government over the last decade aid and abet the rise of a corrosive far-right nationalism. Groups that are supported by the Kremlin to promote its objectives among the population, like Nashi, Walking Together, and trend lines in the regions towards xenophobia, towards protectionism in economic terms that are simply turned a blind eye to on the part of Russian authorities. And the result is that having been deprived of economic opportunity and being seen as an internal abroad, and this is a term from a Russian policymaker who says that, Russia's Muslims are, well, they're Muslim, but they're not so much Russian. They're part of an internal abroad that we need to manage, not that we need to integrate. And that's the key, because Russia's Muslims sense this trend line very well. And as a result, you're seeing an increasing atomization on the part of the Russian Muslim minority and an increasing radicalization. And here, let's stop and just give you an example of what I mean by this. We know our general view of the rise of radical Islam in Russia tends to begin and end with discussions of the North Caucasus, with discussion of Chechnya. We know that the Russians have been waging a grinding, bloody war of attrition against Chechen separatists and Islamic radicals in the North Caucasus for going on 2 decades. The Russian government has said they've succeeded. The objective trend lines suggest that the war is far from being over. But increasingly, that problem is migrating from Russia's periphery into the Russian heartland. A couple of years ago in the winter, I was in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan. The capital city is called Kazan. And in Kazan, there's a busy through street called Gazovaya Ulitsa, right? And you literally can stand there in the middle of the street, as I did. Try not to get hit by cars, right? But stand in the middle of the street and look ahead, and you see the Islamic University of Tatarstan, which is the state-approved, state-funded, state-lionized institution of religious learning. Right? Dmitry Medvedev made a big show of going out there in 2008, did a tour of the facility, praised the rector, praised their curriculum for teaching nation-compliant Tatar Islam, essentially a moderate strain of Islam that is subservient to and lives in harmony with the Russian state as a whole. What you see, if you literally turn around, is something called the Enilur Mosque, the largest radical mosque in the region, paid for by Saudi dollars, paid for by Pakistani dollars, and you have Russian officials who will tell you, if you ask them, that we really have no idea how to deal with this. because it is a challenge, an insurgent ideological challenge to the established religious status quo. And it's not just peaceful. Last summer, two of the highest religious authorities in the Republic of Tatarstan were targeted in assassination attempts. One of those assassination attempts was successful. The deputy mufti of the entire region was killed in a car bomb. You see the growing signs of an insurgent and radical strain of Islam beginning to make its way from the periphery into the Russian heartland, in places like Tatarstan, also in places like Bashkortostan, which is next door, where Russia was forced to deploy security services to quell domestic unrest for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union. Because, after all, the military was dealing with Chechnya. This is an internal matter. So this is something to watch in particular, and we can talk about this in a minute, because Russia's North Caucasus is increasingly on our radar, right? We're not that far away from the Olympics in Russia. We are concerned over the security of the regional environment there. And yet every sign suggests that in addition to the Olympics becoming a very expensive boondoggle for the Russian government, which they are, there's also a serious security concern. Because what Russia has promised the world that it has contained and whittled down and localized in Chechnya and Dagestan increasingly suggests that, the trend line suggests that it's not contained, it's not localized. In fact, it's resilient and it's spreading. It's spreading elsewhere. So that's the second trend line. The third trend line is that, in a very real sense, and I know this is going to sound alarmist, but it's not, and I'll explain why. The Chinese are coming. They're coming for the Russians. The reason I say this is because Russia, a third of Russia, geographically sits in Asia. Russia had an Asia pivot long before the Obama administration had an Asia pivot. Russia's been concerned about accessing Asian markets and sort of doing commerce with Asian states like China, but also if it can fix its territorial disputes with countries like Japan, with South Korea. But increasingly, that area, the Russian Far East and Western Siberia, which cumulatively is 4 million square miles, it's enormous, is barren. Russians are leaving. The population of Western Siberia and the Far East has declined by 20% over the last 2 decades. The reason why is, I think, very simple. When my parents lived in the Soviet Union, they were told where they could or couldn't live. They were given permits to work in a certain city, but not to work in others. And as a result, populations were static. They were stuck in place. And if you wanted to move, there was a process, a political process that you had to go through. And as a result, throughout the Soviet Union, there were people that were working in industries in far-flung locales, like Primorsky Krai, where they wouldn't necessarily stay if they were given a choice. And with the collapse of those visa restraints and those migration restraints, people are leaving. They're leaving for warmer climates. They're leaving for greener economic pastures, but they're leaving. And as a result, the territory of Western Siberia and the Far East now cumulatively has a little bit over 25 million people. That translates out to 6 Russians per square mile. So what this tells you is that Tom Clancy was wrong. You guys remember, back in the 1990s, Tom Clancy wrote a book called The Bear and the Dragon. And it was a book about, the future conflict between Russia and China in which the militaries would go to war. Well, if you ask anybody in the Russian government whether this is a reality, you'll get an answer kind of like what I got when I was there in March. Well, it's never going to happen. You know why it's never going to happen? Because when the People's Liberation Army comes across the border, they're not going to find any Russians to fight. There's no people. But the problem with this is that if there's no people, there's no workforce. And that area has been likened to an energy superpower. It is the economic breadbasket of the Russian Federation. And the investment, both in human capital and in economic terms, that the Chinese government is making in the region dwarfs what the Russian government has done, right? Places like Vladivostok, for example, are far closer geographically to Beijing than they are to Moscow, right? Just look at a map. And so these regions on Russia's distant east, which is in a very real sense still treated by people in Moscow as an economic and also as a political backwater, are increasingly transforming and beginning to view themselves as Asian generally and Chinese specifically. And that tees up a massive problem for Russia, because not only is Russia not able to pivot to Asia economically if it simply doesn't have control, or increasingly doesn't have control over that territory, it is one in which real territorial conflicts can arise, and arise soon. So for those of you that don't know, this is a territory that cumulatively the Russian government and the government of China have tussled over for centuries. The border was demarcated only a few years ago. It was demarcated in 2001 by a treaty called, in typical sort of, grandiosity, typical of friendship and good neighborliness, right? But that treaty is not infinite. The Russian negotiators of that treaty tried to make it infinite, not to have a sunset date. And the Chinese negotiators, their counterparts, said, no, we're good. We're going to make this treaty last for 20 years. So that treaty, the 2001 treaty, tolls, 8 years from now. And you know why it does? Because in 2001, looking forward, the Chinese understood that 2 decades hence, the demographic picture may look very different. We may want to revisit the issue. We may want to reclaim lost lands. And as a result, you're seeing a shift in the human capital, also already in the Far East, and also in the economic capital. And that has real dire implications for Russia as a energy superpower globally, and also as an economic powerhouse in Asia. So those are the 3 macro trend lines that I talk about in the book. And the point that I make is that by themselves, each of these trend lines is deeply damaging to the Russian state. It's not fatal, but deeply damaging if you have a Russian state with the power and political capital and the will to turn things around. They can. But the intersection of all 3 is catastrophic, because what you see out of the Russian government is increasingly a state that is hard-pressed to deal with even one of these dynamics, let alone 3 of them. Putin's state, the state that Vladimir Putin and his followers have built over the last dozen years or so, is built for the here and now. It's not built as a long-term national enterprise. So what Putin does abroad, and by the way, I think all of you remember that old political saw that when you have problems at home, you go abroad, right? So with that in mind, think about Putin's grandstanding on Syria and Iran. It may be not only a reflection of Russian strength, it may be a reflection of Russian strength, but it may also be a reflection of Russian internal weakness, right? Because the state that he's built simply has not dealt with these trends in a serious fashion. Part of the reason it hasn't is because it's not wired that way. Russia's government is, more than anything else, a few years ago, they would talk about it being a form of managed democracy. They don't even talk about managed democracy anymore. It is, more than anything else, a cult of personality that's built around Vladimir Putin and his close circle of followers. It is one that is kept in place by massive corruption and graft and sweetheart contracts. And this doesn't mean that it's total lawlessness, but what it does mean is that attracting the real, serious, sustained international investment, FDI and other things, that are required to turn these demographic trend lines around would require the dismantlement of at least part of Vladimir Putin's state. And that's simply not going to happen. So the Russian government is caught in a cul-de-sac of its own political making. But that doesn't mean that it's going to go quietly into that good night. It doesn't mean that it's simply going to dissolve, it's going to sort of disappear, it's going to collapse. What it could mean is that as we look into the future, and I want you guys to understand that we're not talking about trend lines that are going to set in earnest in the next couple of years. In the next couple of years, what you see out of Russia today is going to be pretty much what you get. But as you look further into the future, a decade or 2 from now, these trends are going to begin to exert an inexorable pull on how Russia behaves. So for example, you can expect them to enhance Russia's imperial impulse, right? We know that Russia still, in a very real sense, covets territories that used to be part of the Soviet Union, territories that were sort of stripped away as a result of history, as a result of political accident, right? Vladimir Putin himself talked in 2008 about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, right? This ideological leaning to reclaim lost lands is likely to be given a shot in the arm by the loss of lands elsewhere. As Russia begins to lose its eastern periphery, the impulse to expand westward, not in political terms, mind you, but in territorial terms, is going to at least be reinforced, if not become simply unquenchable. The second trend line is, and you're going to see this sooner, is it's very likely, as you see the rise of an insurgent strain of extreme Islam in places like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan and elsewhere in what's called the Eurasian heartland, you're going to see a widening of a conflict between the Russian state and these forces that they can't control, right? So we're not talking about one Chechnya. We're talking about many Chechnyas. And this only sounds like an overstatement if you did not watch the emergence of the Chechen conflict and its maturity. Its maturation over time it has taken on a conflict of far larger proportions than was originally envisioned by Moscow. And what I'm saying is that the trend lines you're seeing in the Russian heartland at least have the potential to do the same. They may not, but they have the potential to do so if they're not dealt with. And the third trend line, and I'll stop there, is that you can imagine as Russia contorts internally from these ideological and religious tensions and begins to press westward for demographic as well as economic reasons, there's going to be heightened tensions with Europe and the NATO bloc. Right? All of this is a long way of saying what I said at the outset, which is that we Americans tend to see Russia at face value. When Vladimir Putin strides very large on the world stage, when he has a geopolitical coup with this arms deal in Syria, with sort of his relationship with Iran, we tend to assume that what you see is what you get. Russia is rising, and Russia has to at least be dealt with or accommodated in order to make progress on world affairs. What I'm telling you is that that might not be so simple. In fact, the real challenge for the United States in 20 years, 30 years, may not be from Russia's strength, but it may be from Russia's weakness. And that, I think, should inform serious policy thinking about Russia and our approach to it. Because we know that the reset of relations that the Obama administration has attempted to orchestrate with Moscow in the last 4 years is, well, not as healthy as it could be, I would say, today. Right? We know that the reset has been a failure. And we know now that the White House is at least beginning to think about what comes next. So what this is intended to do is to give them a little bit of food for thought about where Russia is heading. Because knowing where Russia is heading is determinative to figuring out what our policy towards it should be. So thank you, guys. I'll stop there.
We will take questions if you will be so kind as to wait till the microphone is passed to you, and we would appreciate your at least stating your name and an affiliation if you would care to, as a courtesy to our guest. And I'm going to take the prerogative of reading one of the questions we received online. I'm going to change it a little bit. How can the U.S. or could the U.S. effectively support positive transformation in Russia without creating the perception of foreign interference, which only aggravates the anti-American feeling and also would target liberty issues in that country?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it actually sort of to go on a slight tangent for a second. One of the reasons why Russia is so uncooperative on Middle East policy, and for example has spent 2.5 years supporting the Assad regime against its domestic opposition, is because it has seen this movie before. Remember, a decade ago, Russia witnessed on its periphery what we now call the color revolutions, right, in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere. And Russia was petrified then, and is petrified now, that those trend lines from abroad will take hold within Russia. Because here's a dirty little secret. Vladimir Putin isn't all that popular. The last credible polling that I saw came out in the spring from the Levada Center in Moscow, and it suggested that of respondents who voted for, who participated in the vote for the presidential election, the last presidential election in Russia, only 34% said that they would vote for Vladimir Putin. Right? In a democratic society, that is catastrophic. Even in an authoritarian one, it's deeply troubling. Which is why what you see and have seen over the last year has been a deepening of Russia's anti-democratic drift. So the real dilemma for U.S. policymakers is how to square that circle, how to invest in democratic institutions, democratic infrastructure, without being seen as meddling in internal affairs, without having its proxies, whether it's the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, or whatever, blacklisted, listed as foreign agents, sort of, kicked out of the country. I think that's a very difficult needle to thread. And that's the reason why the Obama administration has spent so little time actually thinking about it. Because there's large things that we can work with on with regard to Russia. We can work on strategic nuclear reductions. We can even work on counterterrorism. But these are thornier issues. I think one of the most fruitful conversation that you can have with Russia moving forward, and it may be the start that will then branch into something larger, is a discussion about confessional relations, a discussion about economic opportunity for Russia's minorities. Because Russia and the United States, on a number of issues dealing with radical Islam and counterterrorism, actually have a tremendous amount of commonality. And the Russians are wired to listen when we talk. So especially now, we can start a tactical dialogue on security ahead of the Sochi Games and migrate it into a larger conversation about not using blunt force to deal with your discrepancies in your Muslim minority. Have that become a larger conversation. But it's not an easy conversation to have.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Brown. I'm an intern here. My question was about the liberal opposition within Russia, and I wanted to ask you how much of an influence realistically you think people like Alexei Navalny or the Dozh channel or Echo Moskvy would have going into the future?
I think it's a good question, and the state of Russia's democratic opposition is one of those things that you tend to watch sporadically, right? When Navalny gets put on trial on charges, and then gets released, then gets wrapped up again. You tend to notice, but there's not a lot of sustained attention. I would point out a couple of trend lines: one profoundly negative and one slightly positive. The profoundly negative one is that Vladimir Putin understands very much, because of his popularity ratings, that there is a problem. There is a problem if there's a sustained liberal opposition to his rule. And as a result, he's tried to widen the conversation. So Putin's political faction is known as United Russia. United Russia has undergone a series of very public black eyes over the last 2 years. Members in the Russian Duma, the lower house of parliament, who have been caught with property in the United States, above and beyond what they should have been afforded based on their paycheck. Defense minister who engaged potentially in graft based upon a personal vendetta, all sorts of things, right? All of this has tarnished the United Russia brand. So what Putin has done in the last 2.5 years has been to widen the conversation. Since 2010, he's been talking, and more recently he's been acting, to create something called the Narodny Front, the Russian National Front. This is an agglomeration of about 200 different political organizations, NGOs, social organizations, which are intended to be an umbrella to feed ideas into United Russia. It is intended to, one, rehabilitate United Russia, to show that United Russia is more transparent and accountable. It's listening to all these groups. And the second is to push the liberal opposition to the outskirts of Russian politics. Because if everybody's part of the National Front and you're not, then that just means you're a crackpot. And as a result, Putin has managed, at least so far, to deftly maneuver through Russian politics. But there are hopeful signs that this is not going to be indefinitely the case. For example, mayoral elections in places like Yekaterinburg suggest that this dominance of United Russia and United Russia-linked parties is a transient affair. And left to their own devices, voters will vote to elect somebody else. I'm not exactly sure that they want a specific person, but somebody else, other than the established hierarchy. This is something that the Kremlin is very cognizant over. It's something that it's not clear that the Kremlin can control or clamp down on. It gives you a glimmer of hope that there are yearnings for pluralism beyond the construct that Putin has created. But it's not clear yet that they're going to come to any real meaningful fruition.
Still on that side. Watch out for Richard.
Always do.
Hi, Richard White's Hudson Institute. As you know, one of the projects that President Putin's doing to revitalize Russia's strength is to try and carve out or consolidate control within the former Soviet Union, particularly focusing on the Central Asia and now the South Caucasus. I think the idea is, that would allow Russia to reconstitute perhaps a market that they could basically hold the line against Chinese penetration in some ways through this customs union, Eurasian union, and so on. What do you think the chances of the success of that project would be, and in terms of reversing some of the trends you caution us about?
Well, I think it's interesting, and you mentioned that this was sort of intended as a hedge against China. I think it is up to a point, but I think it's actually a hedge against European liberalization, right? So if you look at what's happened with Russian strong-arming of Ukraine over the last 2 months, you've seen Ukraine that was on track to sign an association agreement with the European Union, and as a result was penalized by the Russian Federation. It was essentially, the Ukrainian government was told in no uncertain terms, if you choose Europe, if you make the mistake of choosing Europe and don't choose my Eurasian economic bloc, there's going to be adverse consequences. For example, a clampdown on trade and a clampdown, sort of a raising of customs restrictions. This is a hedging strategy for sure, but it doesn't alter the overall trajectory. And in fact, among certain governments, it actually increases their push westward, right, to buck the trend of realignment with Moscow. It's not clear that Russia's economy is as vibrant, as dynamic as it needs to be to really draw people to it if the deck was not stacked. And this is, I think, a real problem because, a great little vignette that some of you may have missed was that in the last 2 weeks, China has bought up the equivalent of 5% of Ukrainian territory for agricultural purposes. This is a big deal. It's a big deal because it suggests that China is increasingly moving westward also in its economic plans, but it's also a challenge to Russia because if Russia still covets Ukraine, which it does, if it covets it economically, which it does, increasingly they're not just dealing with Ukraine's western leaning, they're dealing with another more difficult variable, which is the intrusion of China. Against all of these trends, it's not clear that the economic plans of the Russian Federation are robust enough or forward-looking enough that they're actually going to make Russia solvent, that they're going to ameliorate the trends that I talk about. They're certainly trying, but over the long term, I think, this is going to be a very difficult road.
I'm Mendel Edwardson from Israel. I have 2 questions. One is a short-term question about Russia and the Iranian situation, negotiations that may be going on now. What do you think is going on in Putin's mind about that? Would he play a positive role? Would he try to be a spoiler? The second question relates longer term to China, which I think is the name of the game, longer term. And what does these troubling transformations going on in Russia mean for China and China's role on the world scene?
Well, so the Iranian issue first, because I think it's useful to unpack this. I think that when you think about Russia, it's useful to remember that the Russian government is a master of creating a problem and then positing itself as a solution to that problem. So, for example, the Russian government was the one that initiated the sale or approved the sale of S-300 anti-missile batteries to Iran, tabled that sale, and now the sale is back on the table. This is a little bit of a pattern because I think when you look at what Russia is seeking when it comes to its partnership with Iran, it's useful to point out that partnership with Iran is not across the board an uncontroversial issue in Russia. It's not a settled issue. There's a very strong vocal minority that points out that the Islamic Republic is closer geographically to the Russian Federation than it is even to Israel. And it's sort of any capabilities that Iran gains, if they're not careful, could be directed towards Russia itself. But the dominant line has always been cooperation. Cooperation as a result of defense industrial ties, cooperation as a result of the fact that Iran has the potential to exacerbate these radical Islamic tendencies in the Caucasus if it wants to. And so you keep it at bay by engaging in commerce with it. And it's animated by, at least among some in the Russian elite, by good old-fashioned anti-Americanism, right? The best defense is a good offense. And if the West is bogged down with putting out fires in the Middle East, it's less likely to interfere in Russia's own periphery, right? And Russia has legitimate concerns about the encroachment of Europe, the encroachment of NATO, and the encroachment of the United States. And so Iran is useful to them for those reasons, which means that U.S.-Iranian rapprochement, if you think one's going to happen, I personally am a little bit skeptical, but, you know, don't let 30 years of U.S.-Iranian politics stop you. But if you believe that this is actually going to happen, it's going to be different this time, you have to understand that Russia is going to be disadvantaged as a result, because those same paradigms that drove Russian cooperation, if they Russian cooperation with Iran, if they fall away, if Iran is now no longer an adversary of the United States, if now it's now a partner, then Iran moves from being an asset to being a liability. With regard to China over the long term, I think the question is all about Chinese internal dynamics and economics. China needs something on the order of 20 million jobs created every year to keep the unemployment rate stable, which is why you see a massive export of Chinese human capital to Latin America, to Africa, and to the Russian Far East, right? So China's growth, an explosive growth, what's the average, like 10% growth year-on-year average over the last decade, despite the global economic recession, suggests that China needs to fuel the fire. China's hungry. And as a result, China's looking for new economic markets and new economic opportunities. The Russian Far East, in this context, quite frankly, it's low-hanging fruit.
And down here.
David Azarad with the Heritage Foundation. Returning to the demographic issue, I suspect you've read Jonathan Last's book.
Sure.
One thing he points out is the only country that ever turned the ship around is Georgia, because the Orthodox Church got involved, right, and the patriarch was blessing every third child. Could you tell us about the state of the Orthodox Church in Russia? Is it a player? Could this perhaps fix the demographic situation somewhat?
Well, it absolutely is a player, and I think it's a good point to sort of draw out. Something that's remarkable, and again, sort of alliances in Putin's Russia are notoriously mercurial. So, you know, he who is up today may be down tomorrow. He who, you know, who is visible in the TV today may disappear into academia for 7 years and come back, you know. So, but what you've noticed, the sort of the macro trend line that you've seen over the last 3 or 4 years has been this growing closeness between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church, to the point where the Russian Orthodox Church has become, if not a sort of across-the-board rubber stamp for Kremlin policies, certainly a powerful voice vocalizing in support of a large percentage of Kremlin policies. But notice, this isn't a demographic question. This is a political question. This is an enshrinement of conservative ideas as translated by the Kremlin and by the Russian Orthodox Church. Whether this translates into more babies in Russia, probably not. And, you know, it's not a mistake that Putin has hit upon sort of, you know, this alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, because he also sort of saw the trend line in Georgia. He also sort of understands how these things work. But the Russian Orthodox Church, for him, is less of a demographic salvation and more of a political ally.
Benjamin Melanson, Defense Department. You mentioned earlier that during the 1990s, Russia did not have a peace dividend. There was no investment by the government, at least, in social services, medical infrastructure, what have you. During the same period, there was a great deal of U.S. aid, as I recall, in setting up NGOs, public organizations, non-governmental organizations that, to try to build a civil society in Russia. Has there been any evidence or any work that these private institutions have stepped in to fill the void, to perform these social services that the government is not?
I think it's a good question, and yes, you know, I probably overestimated only slightly when I said that, you know, there was no peace dividend. There was, sort of in real terms, right? The Russian economy got better, and there was some ancillary sort of runoff that went to Russian society. But because, you know, per capita GDP now is a whole sight better than it was at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you can't say there was no progress. But what you can see is that there weren't serious systemic investments in precisely the type of infrastructure you talk about, in, you know, transparent elections, in election monitoring, and social services, you know, sort of cultural outreach. That's where the international community came in. That's where you had sort of a real sustained investment track on the part of the international community. We also, by the way, since you're from the Defense Department, you know there was a sustained investment track in the dismantlement of Russia's strategic weapons. Also, the dividends from that, I think, were, we can talk about it. But nonetheless, these were sort of the two main tracks of sort of U.S. interest in post-Soviet Russia. I think what's happening now, when you see the rollback of civil society in Russia, it is very much a function of precisely that. It's very much a function of the fact that the Kremlin sees these entities having been either created or at least partially supported by the international community as a threat, as a potential insurgent threat, right? So the Russian government's approval over the last couple of years of this new foreign agent law, which requires NGOs, political NGOs, not all NGOs, political NGOs that gain even a little bit of financing from the international community, meaning the United States, to have to register as a foreign agent, essentially to be outside of the confines of polite Russian politics, tells you everything you need to know about the fact that the Russian government is more interested in marginalizing these elements than in exploiting them. These elements are effective as political voices, but they're seen as a threat by the Kremlin, and as a result, they're marginalized. So I'm not sure, I certainly haven't done a study of how effective they've been, but I do know, and just based upon Kremlin practice, that they are seen not as a partner, but as a challenge for the Russian government. And as a result, the knives are out.
Leon Peace, Peace Consulting. One question. How does Russia view athletics and sports in terms of improving its world image? For example, Mr. Putin is well known as a judo expert, et cetera,
Right.
which is an Olympic sport.
That's right. No, Mr. Putin trains with the Russian national judo team, which is great. And by the way, when I was in Moscow in March, Steven Seagal was there too. So my childhood was complete with just by seeing that. But I can point out, and this is just a little bit of a funny anecdote, that being a judo black belt in Russia is a little bit different than being a judo black belt in Japan. So when Putin, early in his presidency, went to Japan, there were lots of pictures that made their way into the Russian press and also into the international press of him getting flipped all over the place by an 11-year-old Japanese girl, which I don't know if it contributed to the downturn in Russian-Japanese relations, but it certainly didn't help. But I think it's a good question. And here the Olympics become really important to the extent that the Russian government can show that these are already, by the way, I don't know what the actual tally is as of this weekend, but on the order of dozens of billions of dollars. This is the most expensive Olympics that has ever been constructed. There's lots of indications that there's graft and corruption that are sort of riddling the institution. The head of the Russian Olympic Committee was recently removed and replaced because the project was not on schedule. So this is as much a public image problem for the Russians as it is a security problem. But both things matter. Russia has to provide, right? When the world is watching, Russia has to provide a secure environment, and that means, sadly, it's going to mean a lot of very heavy-handed security tactics, but they have a real problem on their hands. But it's also going to mean that they really have to get their economic ship of state, at least when it comes to the Olympic, up and running so that when the world begins to look at Sochi, it doesn't look like a Potemkin village.
Got one back there and one over here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Nart Chekam. I'm from the North Caucasus diaspora. Last week, I attended a conference, two-day conference at George Washington University about Russia, and a certain statistic jumped out at me. Plagiarism in Russian academic institutions can be as high as 70%. So how can you tell when U.S. officials go to meet with Russian officials? How do you know that these officials are not common thugs with fake resumes?
You can't. In fact, and this is a real problem, right? So that the devaluing of educational integrity in Russia is a symptom of that decline, where there is a culture of corruption, and it does pervade other things. We understand that it pervades industrial and economic sectors, but it does sort of have its impact on ancillary sectors, right? The fact that this is acceptable and that university rectors turn a blind eye tells you everything you need to know about sort of what's for sale and what's not in today's Russia. But then this is why I made mention of it when I was giving my presentation. This is why statistics in Russia, at least in part, are so suspect, because it's very hard to discern who is doing good, viable, sustainable research in Russia, particularly when you have, 70% of resumes padded. That's why I alluded to the UN estimates as sort of being the mean estimates. because they tend to aggregate both the high and the low of what you're seeing. I've seen, Russian statistics which are far more bleak than what I laid out for you. The fact that this is the midline of the estimates should tell you everything you need to know about how bad the situation actually is. So,
hello, sir. Thank you for speaking. I'm Kevin Kennelly from the U.S. Air Force. I was curious about the territorial ambitions you were talking about. Are you talking like just Abkhazia, South Ossetia, or Ukraine, Belarus? Or are you talking Central Europe and the Balkans should be starting to get worried?
No, and again, this is a question. This is a question of eyes being bigger than stomachs and military capability, and nobody's saying that Russia is going to go to war with everyone, outright conflict. But what Putin has built, I mean, the best way to describe it is a postmodern empire, an empire of political and economic influence, even if there's not actual military influence, right? And so those things, for example, Russian strong-arm tactics on Poland to prevent the construction of a pipeline that would create energy independence for Ukraine, things like that, things that would functionally keep these countries in Russia's orbit, even without a shot being fired, are things that should be worrisome. But also, the truism is that the longer Russia's territorial boundaries remain the same without being pushed outward, the more the imperial urge diminishes, and vice versa, which means that the more Russia has military successes abroad, as it did against Georgia, for example, the more its appetite is whetted for other skirmishes along its periphery. So I am not a prognosticator. I can't tell you that Russia is definitely going to go to war over Ukraine or over Belarus or over Kazakhstan, but I can tell you that in those places, they're watching these trend lines closely. And the one variable that they tend not to talk about is how the Russian imperial impulse is being strengthened simply by demographic mathematics, right? If you need to widen your pie, you need to expand your population, you need to add Slavs, right? There's not that many places you can go.
We have one final question. Andrew, right behind you.
Ken Meyercord, World Docs. What's happening with ethnic Russians living in the former republics of the Soviet Union? Are they moving back to Russia, or is there a flow in the opposite direction? Right. And what role do they play, if any, in Russia's relations with those former republics?
Well, the Kremlin would certainly like them to, for sure. And as a result, they've done all sorts of things where they've created, relatively hassle-free assumption of Russian nationality, for example, for people who live abroad, and you can claim Russian heritage, you can sort of get a passport, and so it increases the virtual roles that way, not the actual roles, right? Because they're not in Russia, in the Russian Federation, they're not reproducing. But the trend line in economic and political terms is profoundly negative. Great example of this is that at the tail end of the Medvedev presidency, the Kremlin dreamt up this project of creating a high technology hub outside of Moscow called Skolkovo, right? It was intended as a hub for technology, innovation, on everything from software to biotech, it's sort of everything, essentially the new Silicon Valley. And there are a tremendous number of Russians or people of Russian extraction who are fantastic in the sciences. And Russia reached out to those. And I remember, of course, this wasn't the sum total of the answer, but there are two Russian Nobel laureates that were approached, who now live in the United States and in England, I think, who were approached to sort of come back to Russia and sort of bring their innovation, bring their technology, bring their companies to Russia and sort of set up shop in Skolkovo. And their answer wasn't no, it was hell no. Because they understand very well that the culture, the political culture that exists in Russia is going to mean that their intellectual property is not sacrosanct, that the Russian government is going to be sort of very capricious with how it, giving one of his umpteen presidential campaign speeches, talked about the fact that according to the trend lines that his government was seeing, if this trend line is not ameliorated, by 2050, the entire population of the Russian Federation, which is 142.9 million now, will shrink down by about a quarter to 107 million people, right? That is a massive constriction of the human capital that Russia has currently and can access as it moves into the future. The reasons for this, I think, are manifold, but it's worth at least sort of drawing them out. The first is that Russia, unlike the United States, never experienced a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War in terms of investiture in social and cultural and educational infrastructure. What this looks like in practice is that life expectancy, median life expectancy for Russian males today is the same as it is in Madagascar. It's age 60. The life expectancy for Russian females is a little bit better, it's 73, the same as it is in Saudi Arabia. But both numbers are a decade to a decade and a half lower than they are for their analog governments in Europe and in the United States, right? So, and part of the reason for this is that as a function of Russian GDP, healthcare expenditures in Russia have remained constant since the mid-1990s. The Russian government simply isn't spending more money on the welfare of its people, and it shows. It shows in the numbers. The second reason why Russia's demographics are tanking is that you're seeing a wholesale collapse of the Russian family. During the Cold War, Soviet families, by and large, stuck together, not necessarily because they all liked each other, because we all know that we have members in our family that we could just as soon export to other cities, but because they had no choice, because more than willing to accept a deal that walked us off the ledge of military action against Syria. By the way, it's a deal that is very useful for the Obama administration. I would argue it's much more useful for the Russian Federation because it enshrines the stability of the Syrian regime, right? If it was an open question that the Assad regime might no longer be in power before, it's certainly not an open question now because we need him in power in order to provide us with access to the chemical weapons that we're supposed to dismantle. And not only that, but for the Russians, all sorts of ancillary benefits accrue because Syria has been, since 1971, the way station and the home port for Russia's Mediterranean flotilla. So preserving the Assad regime's hold on power, preserving its stability is a huge coup for the Russian Federation. It's the tangible benefits for us, I think, still remain to be seen. From Damascus, from the discussion about Damascus, you saw President Putin jet off to Tehran, in which he talked about Russia's cooperation with Iran's nuclear program and the potential reactivation of a sale of controversial S-300 missiles to the Iranian regime, something that was tabled during the Medvedev era in Moscow. So again, it's not great progress. But all of this is symptomatic, I think, of something that we're all sensing when we look at U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is not very strategic, at least of late. It's not very assertive. And as a result, there has been an effort by Russia, an opportunistic effort to sort of sweep in and take this strategic advantage. And the Russian government has done, I think, a very successful job. And as a result, it projects an image of a country that's on the march. But if you look at what's happening within Russia itself, it's, I think, very clear that that perception is wrong.
Now on Book TV, Ilan Berman predicts the collapse of Russia due to internal social and demographic decline and external challenges from China. It's about an hour.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys, and I love that John is making his way off the stage, so that when you throw things at me, you have an unimpeded view. Thank you, as always, for your interest, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me. It's always nice to sort of come out and talk about issues that I work a lot on in the privacy of my office, and I get to sort of share it with a broader audience. Let me start sort of where John ended, which is to talk about the external first, and then sort of to focus on the internal. The question of Russia and sort of where Russia is heading, not only ideologically, but also geopolitically and demographically, has been something that I've spent a lot of time looking at, both professionally and personally. My personal history is that I'm the child of Soviet refuseniks, and so I sort of have the culture in my blood. I have the language sort of in my head most of the time, and so and I've spent quite a bit of time in Russia. So it really sort of allows you to get a different bit of a sense. And what I'm struck by is that historically, and by historically I don't mean sort of decades, but certainly in recent years, we Americans, whether we're Republican or Democrat, we tend to look at Russia as one that is striding very large on the world stage. And by the way, you just have to crack a newspaper in the last couple of weeks, and you'll understand exactly why we do that. We've seen Russian President Vladimir Putin really cut quite a striking geopolitical image, strong-arming us into this deal, Syrian deal. But I think strong-arming actually is probably a wrong word, because strong-arming suggests we weren't willing. Relations were locked in place, and there was an extended family network that was cohesive and was kept together by political and economic circumstances. Today, it's exactly the opposite. According to the UN, Russia has the highest divorce rate in the world. Half of all Russian marriages, according to the UN, end in divorce, and 60% of them do so in the first decade. What this means is that long-term families, and as a result, the logical product of long-term families, which is multiple children, is increasingly an endangered species. So you could have a family that has one child, but you very rarely have families that have 4 or 5 or 6 children, which is what's necessary for demographic replenishment. You also have a rampant culture of abortion in Russia, which I think it's useful to stress on a number of levels. During the Cold War, and for those of you that are sort of students of the Cold War, you know that abortion was functionally the only available means of contraception. It was used widespread with terrible effects on female health and female fertility. This hasn't changed all that much. You've seen trend lines which suggest that there has been more awareness on the part of Russian authorities in terms of the negative effects, and also even some investment. But in reality, the numbers are not all that much better. Today, in Russia, official statistics suggest that the rate of abortion is 1.2 million annually. That's equivalent to 300 an hour for a population of 142 million people. But, and this is where it gets even more grisly, if you listen to Russian doctors, private sector experts, they tell you that that network of publicly reported abortions is actually just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, the number could be twice that. It could be twice that because of private clinics, because of abortions that are... Russia may appear strong now internationally, but internally it's approaching a transformation. I would argue it's a transformation that's going to be, when it sets in, every bit as earth-shattering as the collapse of the Soviet Union was some 2 decades ago. And this upheaval is really the product of 3 trends that are beginning to emerge now, but are on trajectory to intersect in a very dramatic way. So the first is, very simply, that Russia is dying, demographically speaking. For those of you that aren't demographers, first of all, good for you, because it's not the most exciting of professions. But for those of you that are demographers, you know that 2.1 is the magic number. During the lifespan of a woman, during the fertility lifespan of a woman, she should ostensibly create 1 child to replace herself, 1 child to replace her husband, and some fraction thereof to account for natural disasters, for earthquakes, hurricanes, what have you. And a population that sits at what's called replenishment rate, 2.1, is a population that remains stable over time. The United States is pretty much there. We can talk about sort of the drivers of what drives U.S. Population. But what's clear is that a whole bunch of countries, certainly in Europe, are well below replenishment rate, and Russia ranks near the bottom. Russia, according to UN statistics, is at 1.6, which means that Russia is, every generation is constricting. What this looks like in practice, if you read Russian statistics and read the Russian census, is that Russia, as a result of both natural death and of emigration from the Russian Federation, is constricting by close to 500,000 people every year. So Vladimir Putin, in December of 2012, when he was given